Okay, so welcome everyone. It is 8 o'clock Eastern time. We really are so happy to welcome you to Drisha's Elul classes, and the first class in this session on forgiveness in Judaism and in philosophy. We encourage everyone to turn on your video if you are able to. We would love to see you. And feel free to ask questions or comment by writing in the chat box here on Zoom, or as a comment on Facebook if you're watching us live right there. This class explores forgiveness, what it is, and why we should forgive. Over the course of 3 sessions, we'll consider 3 different conceptions of forgiveness and its place in our lives. First, we look at forgiveness as a kind of quasi-legal mechanism, a way of wiping clean a cosmic slate marred by wrongdoing. Second, we'll look at forgiveness as an essentially emotional phenomenon. To forgive is to give up the anger towards the wrongdoer, removing potential obstacles to one's own healing. And third, we look at forgiveness as a kind of tool, a power we have to reshape relationships in the wake of wrongdoings. In the course of considering these 3 conceptions of forgiveness in Jewish and philosophical texts, we'll see that each is a kind of a window not only into the conception of a central Jewish practice, but into the human condition. It's my pleasure to introduce Professor Quinn White and Rabbanit Leah Sarna. This will be their first time teaching together, I believe. Very exciting. Professor White received his BA from Yale and his PhD from MIT. He began his positions as assistant professor in the Department of Philosophy at UNL in 2020. His research centers on love and our personal relationships, both of which he argues deserve a central place in our ethical thought. His papers explore questions of honesty and discretion, a secular understanding of the love commandments as a basis for morality, the justification of partiality, forgive me for pronunciation, partiality, sorry, Israeli, the nature of forgiveness, and the ethic of paying it forward. Professor White and Rabbanit Sarna have been dear friends since the first days of their freshman year of college. So very exciting to have you both together, and I'll turn it to both of you.
Thanks. And if people could, we really would love to see people's faces. So if you can rejoin as panelists and turn on your video, that would be really wonderful. Though, of course, we're glad to have you here in whatever way you can show up.
And throughout, we'll be asking you all questions and also inviting questions throughout. If you have a question at any point, or if you want to contribute, or at least in as much as the webinar allows it, you can raise your hand or always use the chat function. And we'll be monitoring that, and definitely want to have this be like as much a normal class as possible, where we're all talking with one another, not on broadcast mode. So should I just get us started? All right, great. So I want to start off by trying to locate what we might think of as our central phenomenon, what we're going to be interested in over the next 3 sessions. Like, what is this forgiveness thing that we're talking about? And one, I think, helpful way to zero in on our topic is to consider some of forgiveness's relatives. So one thing that seems right about forgiveness is it's something that we do in the wake of a wrong, when one person has wronged another, and the wronged person has an opportunity to forgive in some way, to maybe let the person off the hook who did some wrongdoing. But there are a lot of sort of related ways of, very crudely speaking, letting someone off the hook that seem to be importantly different from forgiveness. So here are 3. And we're going to be using, we're going off of a handout throughout, so make sure you have that handout open. We won't be sharing our screen. So one, imagine, say, you own a corner grocery shop or something like that, and I steal food from your shop. And one thing you might do in terms of like letting me off the hook is maybe you might justify my theft. Maybe you might say something, or someone else might say something to you like, look, he has a family, he's out of money, he's starving, this was the only way to make it through the week. And if you were to offer something of a justification, it's sort of taking what at first seemed like a wrong and saying, look, for the most part, things like that are wrong, but actually in this case, it wasn't wrong. There's some justification for doing it. That immediately feels different from something like, I forgive you for what you've done. Another thing you might do is say, excuse my action. So again, let's suppose that I'm this person who's stolen from your shop. Maybe like you might find out something about me that makes sense of my behavior. It doesn't justify it, but in some way tells against, blaming me too harshly. Like maybe I was really badly raised, or maybe I'm addicted to opioids, or I was I was drunk or something like that. These might be considerations that they don't make what I did right in the way that, say, trying to save my kids by stealing might make it right, but they mitigate the wrong. Again, that feels different from forgiveness. It's one thing to say something like, look, he just didn't know what he was doing, or he was mistaken, or he was drunk. It's another thing to say, I forgive you. A third sort of thing that you might sort of have in this vicinity is what's sometimes called condonation, where you condoning an action, where that's something basically just like, thinking, I'm just going to let this be. I'm not going to engage with it. I'm not going to sort of hold someone to account. Where, sometimes there are sort of funny philosophy papers about this, where it seems like the central example for condonation is always like a mother-in-law's being invasive. And, you just decide, I'm not gonna put up a fight. Where here, condoning behavior is in some way just letting it go. But again, that feels really different. Like imagine, your mother-in-law has been horrifically rude to you in some way or another. It's one thing to forgive your mother-in-law. That actually might be a sort of difficult thing to pull off. It's another thing to just let the behavior go. So what is this extra thing that's involved in forgiveness? And for one, actually the mother-in-law case kind of raises an interesting question. Why might it actually be delicate to use words like, oh, I forgive you for what you said, as opposed to just letting it go? Well, one thing that seems to be crucial to forgiveness is a sort of presupposition that the person has done wrong. That's why justification seems to be sort of playing in a different ballpark. And that's why it actually can be quite delicate to say something like, I forgive you, because that's a way of, among other things, pointing out, taking for granted that the person has done wrong. But it seems like there's a lot more to forgiveness than just some kind of presupposition that you've done wrong. So one of the central questions that we're going to ask is what forgiveness is. Very, very roughly, I want to kind of start off with thinking of what it feels like to forgive. So imagine, just think to a time that you actually have forgiven someone. One of the sort of the phenomenology of forgiveness seems to be something like letting go. There's some distinctive way in which, in the wake of wrongdoing, the forgiver lets the wrong go, not by justifying it, not by excusing it, not just by condoning it. There's something special that's happening. But there is this kind of feeling of letting go. And so the way I want to set up the question, and today is going to sort of offer one answer to this question, is what is it that we're letting go of when we forgive? And related to that, why do it? And I mean this in two senses. One is a kind of particular sense, and like in a given case, what reasons do we have to forgive someone? What reason do you have to forgive your mother-in-law? Or what reason might you have to forgive me for stealing food from you? And I also mean this more broadly, like what role does this practice play in our lives, both interpersonally and in a relationship with God? And so we're going to consider over the course of 3 sessions, 3 approaches. And I want to just flag off the bat that these aren't, these should be seen as not necessarily mutually exclusive. They're going to be, these are kind of families of views or ways of thinking about forgiveness. There are going to be lots of different people who disagree about lots of things, but might fall into one camp. And our interest in this is not going to be sort of adjudicating which one is right or wrong, but kind of trying to get in view 3 different perspectives on this practice, forgiveness, and see what sort of they can teach us about our lives. And these 3 views, the first of which we'll be talking about today, one is a kind of legalistic approach. A second is a sentimentalist approach, where by sentimentalism, I mean having to do with some kind of distinctive sentiments, moral sentiments in particular, like anger or resentment. And the third, which has no nice name, is sort of seeing forgiveness as a kind of tool for shaping our relationships. So I'm going to pass it back to Leah to talk about the first of the texts that we have on our handout. So again, if you don't have the handout up, it's been posted in the chat, and definitely bring it up so that we can be looking at this passage together.
Yeah. So this is a really amazing passage from the Gemara from the Bavli in Masachet Yoma. And before we look at the passage, we have to think to ourselves, what is kind of the opposite of forgiveness? So Quinn just laid out kind of what forgiveness is not. So forgiveness is not justification, excuse, condemnation. But so that's all kind of maybe like neutral compared to the opposite of forgiveness, which I think we could maybe posit is vengeance, bearing a grudge. Those are things that maybe are the opposite of forgiveness. And the Gemara here does this amazing thing where it lays out, actually there's a time for vengeance and there's a time for bearing a grudge. So the Gemara says in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, Mishum Rabbi Shimon ben Yehutzadak, Kol Tamid Chacham she'eno nokim v'noter kenachash eno Talmid Chacham. Any Torah scholar who does not avenge himself and bear a grudge like a snake when insulted is not considered a Torah scholar. So, and obviously you want to be a Torah scholar, which means that an attribute of a Torah scholar is that, and a good attribute is an attribute of someone who is vengeful and holds a grudge. And then the Gemara obviously responds, hold up, there's a verse in the Torah that says, lo tikom v'lo titor, right? There's a verse in the Torah that says, don't take vengeance and don't bear a grudge. And so then there's like a discussion back and forth. Well, maybe that's only talking about money. Maybe that's only talking about objects. This is talking about emotions. And then, right, so maybe it's about, and then the Gemara goes on to say, okay, well, maybe it's about tzara de gufa. It's about like your own tsar, your own personal anguish. Gufa here, sometimes gufa means body, but I think here it means like of yourself, tsar of yourself. But obviously it could be, I didn't give you the whole like ellipsis there in between, so there are some interpretive possibilities, but we're gonna like jump over that for now. And then the Gemara says, hold on, like, are you really supposed to take vengeance for or hold grudges about personal anguish? Don't we have a Braita that says, "Hane'elavim ve'inan olvim shomim charfata ve'inan mashivim osim me'ava usmichim b'yisurim alehem ha'katuv omer b'ho'avav ketzit hashamesh b'gvureto." It's taught in a Braita, so in earlier Tanaitic material, those who are insulted but don't insult others, who hear themselves being shamed but don't respond, who act out of love for God, who remain happy in their suffering. About them, the verse states, they that love him, they that love God, be as the sun when it goes forth in its might. Meaning it's really good to like turn the other cheek, which I always want to remind people is a verse from Lamentations, not from the New Testament originally. Right, so this Braita seems to be really in favor of, just like take it in, don't hold a grudge, don't avenge. So here's the Gemara really pushing back on that original statement by Rabbi Yochanan. But then Rabbi Yochanan is like the hero of the Gemara, right? So we're never just going to leave it as like, oh yeah, Rabbi Yochanan was wrong. Rabbi Yochanan kind of always has to be right. So what do we say about Rabbi Yochanan? Oh, well, that Braita, we say in defense of Rabbi Yochanan, that Braita, that's really just talking about someone who actually does something in their vengeance. Like, you're not supposed to do anything about it, but you can still hold it. The prohibition against taking vengeance applies, but you have to keep it in your heart, right? So the Gemara defends Rabbi Yochanan says you're just not allowed to do anything about it, and what the Braita is telling you is that you're not allowed to do anything about it. And then we say, hold on, but we have another statement by Rava, Amar Rava, Kula ma'avir al midotav, ma'avirin lo al kol pesha'av. Didn't Rava say, whoever forgoes his reckonings with others for injustices done to him, the heavenly court in turn forgoes punishment for his sins too. So if you kind of release other people's responsibility from their wrongs towards you, then God will release kind of your responsibilities towards your wrongs towards God. So we're going to hold those two dynamics of like interpersonal sins and sins between humans and God. That's going to be obviously a big theme that we'll see in a moment in Maimonides particularly bring up. But here, Rava is actually suggesting that there's a relationship between them. If I show what we might sometimes call rahmanut, like mercy, to other people, then God will be merciful. Potentially, God will be merciful with me. That's like a theology put forward by Rava, which means, right, that like if I want God to not hold grudges or be vengeful vis-a-vis me, then I should probably not hold grudges and not be vengeful vis-a-vis other people. And then Gemara says, the mefai sulei umefayes. That only applies, Rava's position only applies if they did something called pius. Pius is a little bit of a hard word to translate, and we're going to see it again and again in Jewish sources about this. It means that the best beginning of a translation would be to appease, that someone came and tried to appease, and then you were appeased. And that's when Rava's situation would apply. But if someone, so just to like dig into that language a little bit about appeasement, someone who tries to appease, so an interpretive question we're going to have, obviously, is can that be really translated as forgiveness or apologizing? An attempt to appease, is that an apology? And then when I am appeased, is that forgiveness, right? So someone attempts to appease, then I have been appeased. Is that a situation of an apology and forgiveness? That's like an interpretive question of like what the project that Quinn and I are trying to do. Like, are we just kind of like forcing our own terms onto this text in a way that's not totally fair? That's like an interpretive question I wanted to like raise up as we're looking at Jewish texts about these terms, and just like kind of be honest about that. Like, obviously forgiveness is an English word, and we're digging into its English meaning, and obviously our texts are not written in English, and so the words just have like different resonances, but we're gonna kind of do our best with a category of ideas that like feel really relevant anyways. But what I also wanted to lift up is what Rashi translates, this is on the beginning of the next page, right? Rashi translates, Rashi is a commentator from the 1100s. Rashi says the mefaisule, right, that he tries to appease him. Levakesh mechila, he requests this is a word that we almost always translate as forgiveness, that he requests forgiveness. But the upshot of the Gemara, which is where the English kind of says this out, and the Koran translation just makes this explicit in the way that the Gemara itself does it, is that, okay, but if the person didn't request forgiveness, then actually there's still a place for vengeance, and actually there's still a place for holding a grudge, because what's at stake here? What's at stake for the Torah scholar? What's at stake for the Torah scholar is the Torah itself, right? So if there is an insult to the Torah, you can't just let that go because the Torah is important, and we can't just be like, oh, blah, 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 like I should be so nice and let the Torah get trampled on. No, of course not. We have something to defend here, and when we're defending something, we can't be lax about it, right? We're fighting on behalf of the Torah, and so what that means is, yes, if someone comes and says, oh, I insulted the Torah, or I insulted the Torah through insulting a Torah scholar, and I apologize for that, then of course we should allow ourselves to be appeased. We should accept the apology. But if not, then there's still this like debt hanging, and that's this concept that we're getting at here. This concept of there's a debt hanging, and until there's an apology, that debt is not relieved. So that's the Gemara in Yoma, and then Maimonides. Oh, Quinn, did you want to say anything before we move on to Maimonides? Okay. Right. So if you're following in the handout, we just finished the Gemara and the Talmud in Yoma, and we have here like just a note for those of you following along, right? Like this reflects an extremely influential approach to forgiveness, which is right as Quinn prefaced from the beginning. Forgiveness is weaving a moral debt incurred by wrongdoing, right? So someone insulted, let's say the Torah or a Torah scholar, that debt hangs, according to the Gemara, until a person comes and asks for forgiveness, and forgiveness is then given. Otherwise, that debt stands. And we see a very similar thing come up in Maimonides' Laws of Tshuva. And obviously, having my mom here, I should say I learned these first with her, so everything I'm about to say is hers. Okay, so here we go. So, and there's a lot of interesting things going on here that we're gonna pick out. So in So Teshuvah, right, repentance, and Yom Kippur only work for sins that are between man and God. So if you ate a forbidden food, you engaged in forbidden sexual relationships, things like that. The forbidden sexual relationships things, I think you actually have to like bracket. That's like a big conversation. Is that really just about man and God, or could that actually be about people too? But Maimonides brings that in as an example, but we're not gonna fall down a rabbit hole of discussing that. But continues Maimonides of all averut shebin adam lechaviro, and he brings a bunch of examples there. You curse a colleague, you steal from him, things like that. Eino nimchalo leolam. They're never forgiven for you until they're never forgiven until you repay what you owe your colleague. And this is a different word for appeasement, yiratzehu. So the last one was pius. This one is yiratzeh. Ritzeh is like the same word as ritzeh, like they want it, would be another way of kind of make them want to receive it from you, yiratzehu. Okay, so you have these like two different dynamics where you might have thought, okay, there's this like bad thing that I did in the world, and then Yom Kippur transpired, and Yom Kippur is the like forgiver of all things. So the bad thing that happened in the world is now wiped clean. But the answer, but like the thing that Maimonides brings out, and this is something we're going to be discussing over the course of the rest of the series, is like, no, that's actually not enough. For interpersonal sins, that's not enough. For interpersonal sins, it's not just like, oh, there's like this metaphysical like debt that was incurred, and then I did this like metaphysical thing that was like the Yom Kippur service, or like the day of Yom Kippur, or however it is that Yom Kippur works, and that's again another conversation for another time. And now it's like wiped clean. No, like actually, if it's against the person, you have to like go and do the thing with the person, and if it's with God, then you have to do repentance vis-a-vis God. So it's not just that like Yom Kippur happens and the day is wiped clean. There's at least Yom Kippur and Teshuvah vis-a-vis God. Okay, and so then just to continue on that like interpersonal note, the Maimonides continues. So let's say I stole from somebody and I returned the money that I owed that person. Still, I still need to appease that person, and I still need to ask that person for forgiveness. It's not just that like, oh, there was a loss of money and now that money has been regained, so the debt has been fulfilled. No, there's like something much more complicated going on here. There's still this like emotional piece of the equation that my debt isn't forgiven to that person until they forgive me. It's not just, even though I like in like literal like physical terms, I have repaid the debt I owed them. If let's say I stole $5 from Quinn and now I have repaid him $5, it's not enough. There's like something more added into the equation. There's like a moral hunk of the equation now that cannot be balanced out until I've asked forgiveness from Quinn and Quinn has forgiven me. And then he goes on to say that there's actually even more to it, right? So if the person who I wronged Quinn, and Quinn says, I don't want to forgive you, Leah, for stealing $5 from me. Then right? So you bring a row of 3 friends, and we all those people come with me, and we all request forgiveness from Quinn together. Right? So if I do that 3 times, and if after the 3rd time that happens, if Quinn does not forgive me, then I can actually leave him. And this is like a really interesting turn that Maimonides here takes. The person who refuses to grant forgiveness is the one considered the sinner. So all of a sudden, there was let's say there was a monetary debt. Oh, and I owed Quinn $5. I paid him those $5. There's still this like moral element remaining, but I have like fulfilled my side and more of that moral element. And then there's like this tilt that now, because I've gone so above and beyond on my like moral piece of the equation, it actually became imbalanced in the Quinn direction. And now Quinn like owes me because he refused to do his moral part and accept my apology and forgive me. So that actually turns the forgiveness into this like moral act. It's not just like it's not actually all on the apologizer. There's actually a piece of the equation that actually lands on the wronged party at a certain, at least after a certain number of like checks have been fulfilled. And we saw this in the Talmud too, that at a certain point, right, that's the statement of Rava and the Breita also, that like we want people to be forgiving, and that once someone, right, that the last sentence in the Gemara is like, once someone has apologize, then you really want to be the person who forgives them, because then God will forgive you also. So there's kind of like an obligation on the forgiver at a certain point here. That's a very, very interesting type of obligation. And then we'll just round out this last paragraph and I'll turn it back over to Quinn. Asur la'adam liot achzari v'lo yitpayis, right? A person shouldn't be cruel or refuse to be appeased, refuse to forgive. Rather, you should be easily pacified, hard to anger. And the minute a person who is wronged asks for forgiveness, you should forgive him immediately with a complete heart and a willing spirit. And even if you really wronged him, you should still not seek revenge or bear a grudge, but rather be kind of immediately forgiving. Quinn, do you want to open it up for discussion now, or do you want to move on to your next piece and then open it up for discussion?
Maybe let's move on to the next piece and then open it up for discussion after sort of that view gets put on the table.
Okay, super.
So one thing that philosophers are supposed to do is like, be puzzled by things that are otherwise obvious. And so I'm going to try to ask some questions for things that might have seemed obvious to try to like get us puzzled about it, and then try to introduce a kind of picture that resolves this puzzle. So one question you might have about both of these texts is, why should you be hard to anger but easily pacified? So like, if I'm supposed to be easily pacified, one sort of natural explanation is because, well, anger isn't the kind of thing I should have, or vengeance isn't the sort of thing that I should do. But that's not the picture. The picture seems to be one that sort of sees a place for anger and for vengeance, and like sees it as crucial that you be pacified when appropriate. So why would that be? How can we sort of have our cake and eat it too? A second question that you might have in sort of response to this is, why, kind of tied to this, why am I, the person from whom Leah stole, why am I obligated to forgive her if she apologizes? So if she does the appeasing, why is it a sin for me not to forgive? That's a kind of weird thing, or something to be puzzled by. The third is, why think that, again, sort of keeping with this example of theft, so Leah steals $5 from me, why isn't it enough for her to just give me the $5 back? Why is more owed? Why is this ritual important? Why is appeasement necessary? And then the last bit is, why think that Leah has to get forgiveness from me? So, I mean, suppose Leah gives me the $5 back and sort of gets right by her relationship with God. Why is there something else that she needs to do to me, or for me, or with me? Why are sort of both pieces of this necessary? So what I want to do is introduce a picture from sort of contemporary English-speaking philosophy that is really drawn from one of my teachers whose first anniversary of her passing is coming up, and absolutely wonderful philosopher named Judy Thompson. And she has a picture that I think will make sense of some of the potentially puzzling features of forgiveness. And so it might first seem like, why are we talking about this kind of weird stuff? And I promise it'll come back together. So one of the things that Judy thinks is that, and I'm going to start using my whiteboard because I'm a little old-fashioned. So the key claim that Judy defends in this very famous book called The Realm of Rights is that we together occupy a series of bipolar, which is to say something with two parts, sort of two poles, bipolar relations, that human beings are bound together by rights. And rights is, the word right is something that we often hear in the law, like a right to free speech. And sometimes I think in some of these contexts, it might seem weird to use a word like right. But I want to let's put some of the baggage that we have with the word right to the side and kind of just sort of take her at face value for what she means by it. What she means is that much of our lives, morally speaking, can be understood as in some way connecting, that there's some kind of connection between two people. So say we're going to use this example of, Leah stole from me. So there's Leah, there's Quinn, so short hair, somewhat longer hair, but my bad drawings. Okay, so she owes me some money back. So there's this idea for there to be a right is to say that there's some kind of connection between me and Leah of like giving me $5 back. She owes me $5. Another way of saying that is I have a right to $5 from her. In the sort of technical language that Judy uses in the book, which sounds kind of strange, but it's how philosophers often put it, I have a right against Leah that she give me the $5. And by against, that's not necessarily antagonistic. It just means sort of with respect to Leah, I have this right. And likewise, with respect to me, Leah has an obligation of giving me $5. Now, sometimes rights, obligations, there are these things like money where it kind of makes sense. But one of Judy's key claims is that our life is structured by these things, even in places where you might not have thought it. So let's forget my bad hair drawings for a second. Like, what do I, in a moment like this, what kinds of rights relations do I stand into you all? Well, here's one sort of like really basic one. You all are here, you're giving me your time, and I owe you something, namely that I prepared for class, like that I did something to like make this a worthwhile experience for you. Putting it in sort of the other way around, you have a right against me. Again, that might sound overly legalistic, but the idea is here, you have a right against me that I be prepared. And so too, do you have a right against Leah? And I have all kinds of rights against you too. So it might be that sort of in the other direction, we have another right, which is something like a right not to be interrupted. Like you owe it to me not to just unmute yourself and start talking. Now, why think of things in this way? Well, there are a few things that are supposed to come out of this picture. So one is the idea that we can understand wrongdoing as a violation of these things that bind us together. There are many, many, many sort of bindings that we have vis-a-vis one another. This is just, sort of one really basic example, but also that we be kind to one another. Perhaps that like, maybe I have a right against you that like, if you see me all of a sudden have a heart attack, you owe it to me to like call 911, or at least one of you does. So there are lots of these kinds of relations that we stand into one another. And the basic idea is that to wrong another person is to sort of to violate this connection. Now, what follows from one of these connections being broken or shattered or not honored? Well, one of the key claims that Judy has is that there are all of these, what we might think of as subsidiary rights, or sometimes it's called moral residue, that comes in the wake of some kind of shattering of a right or some kind of violation of the connections that we stand into one another. So suppose we have something like this one that I have as a kind of crude example. This right that you have against me that I prepare for class, that I've done some prep. So what happens if this is broken? Well, now I might owe you some kind of recompense. There are things that follow. There are new rights that emerge because this one was not honored. So one might be something like an explanation. Maybe I owe you also something like an apology. Maybe I owe you also something like a makeup session. But the idea is that these are also now can be understood as rights. And so another right that I might have is like a right not to have my money stolen. That's a right that I have against all of you. That's a right that you all have against me. So if Leah takes my money, there are going to be these subsidiary rights that emerge because that sort of core right was violated. So we return to that example. I have a right not to have my money stolen. Now, if Leah were to violate that right, I get all kinds of sort of things in response. Again, I'm going to get some kind of right to an apology, maybe some kind of right to an explanation, and a right to my money back. So on this sort of picture, the key thing is that we all stand in many of these relations to one another, and these relations are interlocked, they're connected. Now, one thing that's very special about rights is that we have a kind of power over them. We can make them go away, at least many of them, those rights that aren't inalienable rights. So I have this ability to, for instance, make the right that I have that you all not interrupt me go away by saying something like, okay, let's open it up for discussion. Again, that might sound really weird, like that I'm taking away a right, but this is just a sort of a way of conceiving of what's happening when I give permission. Likewise, you might waive a right against trespass, say, by inviting me into your home. On this sort of picture, this way of thinking of it, we stand in this kind of moral relation. I'm not allowed to just walk into your house, but you can sort of take that away by saying it's okay to come in, or like, you're welcome to my home. So what is on this kind of picture, what's happening when we forgive? So let's go to this example of Leah stealing my money. So I have a right to my money. I have a right not to have it stolen. Leah takes it from me. Now here's this thing that I can do. I have like basically these two new rights. A right to get my money back. You might think actually in some ways that's just the original right. And a right to some kind of apology, maybe some explanation, especially given that she's my friend. Now here's something I can do. I can say, you know what, Leah, keep the money, I forgive you. On this sort of picture, what is happening in that moment is I'm doing this thing that we do all the time, getting rid of a right, waiving a right. What I am, if I forgive Leah for stealing my money, I'm waiving the rights that I have, these rights to some kind of recompense. I can waive them. I can just make them go away. I can say, Leah, you know what? It's fine. You don't owe me the money. And maybe as long as you've apologized at least a little bit, you don't owe me any more apology. You don't owe me any more explanation. I can cancel that debt. So this is one of, and I think it's sort of one of the most influential ways of thinking about forgiveness. Sort of something has gone wrong, and in light of that wrongdoing, there's this debt that's owed. What is the debt? It's one of these subsidiary rights that emerges in the wake of wrongdoing. And to forgive is to cancel a debt. So on this kind of picture, why is it the case that, like, if Leah steals from me, that it's not enough that she just give me the money back? Well, because there are more sort of debts that have been incurred. It's not just the $5, it's something more. like owing an explanation, owing an apology. That's kind of built into the original right that I had. In the same way that if I just like totally blew off this class and was a jerk, it wouldn't just be that I owed you a makeup class. There would be a lot more that I might owe. And why is this the sort of thing that it would be sort of a sin for me as the forgiver not to forgive? Well, if Leah has paid this debt, if she's made good on those rights, then for me to sort of continue to press my claim would be as absurd, sort of like as inappropriate as if I loaned Leah $5 and she paid me back and I said, you still owe me another $5. The debt's been paid. So debts are the sort of things that can be paid back, and they're the sorts of things that can be waived. And so in a picture where, if we're thinking not just about something like money, but something like vengeance, this sort of picture would say vengeance is just another one of these kind of subsidiary rights that emerges in the wake of wrongdoing. So suppose I've been insulted. I have a kind of a right against this person to get my due. I'm now entitled to do things that I wouldn't otherwise be entitled to do, to take some kind of vengeance. Now, the shape that vengeance might take will depend on what kind of wrong it was. There are sort of vengeance that might be appropriate or inappropriate, but there's some kind of retributive action that I'm now entitled to, that I have a right to. That there's this sort of debt that I'm owed. And I can waive that debt. And likewise, that debt can be paid by way of apology and by doing whatever it takes to make up for the wrong. Now, there's this last element, I think, that's really crucial in this picture, which is that all of these rights, the sort of philosophical word for it is bipolar. They have sort of two poles. Rights are things that link two people. Sometimes there can be sort of collections that have more than two people in them. But sort of the core case is that I owe it to Leah that blah. I owe it to you, not sort of you, just you collectively, but I owe it to each of you, given that you're here to do right by this class. And each of you owes it to me. Rights bind people in a way that's sort of directional. They link us. And so this is, I think, this is at least a kind of picture that makes sense of why something like Yom Kippur isn't enough to just like waive the moral guilt that Leah would have if she stole my money. Because the right that was violated is a right between me and Leah, in addition to violating a commandment that God has issued. And so inasmuch as Leah needs to sort of make good on the rights that were violated, she needs to not only sort of respect the fact that a commandment of God was violated, but also a connection between the two of us. So there's sort of, in the case of wrongdoing, there's sort of two relevant connections here. The wrongdoer bears a connection to an interpersonal wrongdoing, the person that has been wronged, and a commander whose command was violated. And I think thinking of things in terms of these, of the moral obligations we stand in as connections between us can make sense of that. So I want to, if it's all right with you, Leah, just like pause to take questions before we go on to the next text, because that was like a lot of philosophy and all of which was probably unfamiliar or at least new. So
what are you calling people? Yeah.
Okay, so let's start with Matthew.
This may be more of a curiosity question, but in the interest of figuring out how these accounts link together, was Thompson a theist or an atheist? Did she believe that these rights have like a guarantor or like an issuer or like a wellspring from which they originate? It seems like that is sort of an important thing to think about when sort of linking sort of non-theological ethics to theological ethics.
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. I don't know. I think that I don't want to guess, but certainly her philosophy is wholly secular. Like the picture she has is one that doesn't depend on the existence of God. But as she thinks of rights, she wants to be a pluralist about where they come from. So different rights come from different places. So the right that I have, like with respect to my money, like that doesn't like come from anything sort of mysterious. That just comes from the law. Like the law has established property rights, like money came from the US government. And so the US government did some things, they passed some laws that then create a structure that binds each of us. And you might think some of these rights don't come from the government, they come from God, or they just come from nothing. They're just there in virtue of being human beings. But this picture sort of allows these things that bind us together to come from all kinds of different places. And so you might have a view on which they all come from God, or some of them come from God and some of them come from the law and some of them come from nothing. They're just fundamental. But wherever they come from, there's a further thing, which is who they bind. So when if Leah steals my money, it's not that she's just wronged the government. Sort of the law came from the government, but she wronged me. The rights violation was mine. Excellent question. Mona.
So thank you for a very thoughtful teaching so far. It's an honor to be with you. Leah, we go, our families go way back. So I just wanted to add a psychological perspective and a Buberian perspective to the rights language to talk about relational responsibility, which I think is really key to the process of forgiveness. There's a tremendous amount, there's a very large literature in psychology on forgiveness. And most of it is influenced by Christian theology. And the idea is that the person who was wronged, the obligation is on them to do the forgiveness, and it's unilateral, whether or not there's what we would call teshuva, whether there's any interpersonal process, because Christ forgave, so we should forgive. That is, I think, it works for Christians, which is great. I think it's a very problematic psychological process, and it's definitely not the Jewish process. I want to just mention a wonderful book by Janice Spring called How Can I Forgive You? The Courage to Forgive, the Freedom Not to. And she presents more of a Jewish perspective, which is that genuine forgiveness is really this teshuva process that Maimonides describes, right? The Rambam describes, which is I do first, and we didn't go into all of the prep work for the person who's asking for forgiveness, right? You go to therapy, you do your work, right? You transform yourself. You're no longer the same person. You make amends. You feel remorse. There's a whole lot of personal work there that's going on, and interpersonal work. So ideally, that's the process of teshuva that I think Rambam is talking about. And I think ultimately that's the most satisfying kind of work between people. But what do you do if the offender doesn't come to you to make amends? And then she has a whole, I won't go into her whole thing, but it's a really interesting layout of options, right? Because what the literature has shown is that holding a stance of unforgiveness, holding on to the revenge, and the rabbis are sort of, in the Talmud are sort of recommending this, do it quietly, some of them are. It kills you, literally. It the anger, the chronic anger is ultimately what gives, many people a heart attack. So, and chronic inflammation and all the other bad stuff. So holding on to anger is really not a good idea for the person's health. But I also want to just mention, Martin Buber talked about how when we hurt another person, when we injure the world order, we need to repair the world order. And if we can repair at the place where we injured it, great. If that person isn't available or has died or whatever, then we do it in some other way. But there's a sense of obligation and co-responsibility for the world that I think represents Buber's ideas. And there's a lot of work now in intergenerational family therapy and also in relational psychology about relational responsibility, relational ethics, which I just want to throw into this conversation. What do we owe our dialogue partners, our children, our parents, our friends, our earth, each other? This is not to get too political here, but this is very much a live issue for us right now in our world. So I don't think it's only about rights, although rights are important, and the injury of rights, but it's also about responsibility. And I just want to add that language in, which is much more relational. that the research shows that we are deeply interdependent relational creatures, and that our well-being is intertwined with the well-being of others on this planet, but certainly closer to home as well. So when we injure someone, we're injuring the whole system. So I just wanted to, it's a lot I threw out there.
Oh no, you're giving away our next 2 classes.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, if I can just say, like, I think the way that I would want to sort of hold a space for this thought is so I think we should set aside the question of whether what I just put on the board is anything like what is the whole of what Maimonides was saying. Surely it's not. But here's a picture. And I think that both elements that you've just raised are not present in this picture and might make you think we have not found the sort of heart of forgiveness. If, like, I never mentioned anger. Nowhere in the notion of forgiving a debt was getting rid of an emotion like anger or letting go of an emotion like anger. And that's a sort of the idea, holding some space for the emotional process of forgiveness is there's one sort of strand in philosophical thought that says, no, that's just something else. We don't care about that. Forgiveness is this debt stuff. And there are other people who we're going to look at next week who are like, no, the emotional stuff is where it's all at. You got to have the that piece is necessary. And this other element you mentioned about sort of putting the world back together, that's also really not here. And I think that this picture can be extended in ways that make sense of that, but sort of those extensions will, like Leah said, will, I think, be exploring in the next two sessions. But I think, yeah, that is perfect tee up for where what I think would be natural to feel is missing from this picture. Like, where was all this other stuff that seems so important about repair, about putting things back together, about anger? Yeah, excellent. And maybe for the sake of time, Joy, we can apologize. I'm happy to stay after, and I'd love to hear what you had to say, but maybe we should move on to the next section.
That's okay, because I think Mona touched on what I was asking. I was just concerned about if there's a debt that Leah owes you, and then you simply forgive her, so the whole situation is over. My feeling is that you owe her something. You owe her an explanation as to why it made you feel angry.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And that there's, yeah, that there's something that needs to happen between us. That's not just like, okay, I got rid of this thing, debt forgiven, all done. There's more to the process. There's more to be done.
Right.
Quinn, I'm wondering whether we should do the next source of the Talmud or actually skip to the Exodus. Or
I think we should largely skip. Let me just say one quick thing that I had wanted to use this text to bring out. So one, I think, element, and again, we might already be so unhappy with this picture that we're ready to move on to something a little more rich that has more in it. But one thing that I think we can carry with us to other perspectives on forgiveness is when we're thinking about why we should forgive, this sort of picture suggests a few answers to why forgive. One answer to the question why forgive is because the debt is paid. Now, sort of Mona raised this really important thing. Well, maybe one reason that I might want to forgive Leah is because it's going to eat me up inside if I stay angry at her. Maybe another reason to forgive Leah is because I don't want this relationship between us to be destroyed. We got to start putting things back together. Let's hold off on those thoughts. One reason to forgive, the sort of simple reason that emerges on this picture, is because sort of Leah paid her debt, and paid debts need to be recognized as paid. Another kind of thing that I think emerges from this is the importance of vengeance that, like I was at least thinking we can really find, especially in the Talmud passage, is that, like, when someone has wronged you, there's an importance to take, the language of vengeance or retribution is in part appropriate because you need to stand up for some value that's been threatened. So another reason to forgive on this sort of picture is because the threat is gone. Like, why is it so significant why is something like apology significant? Well, in part, it seems like what happens if Leah apologizes or if she gathers 3 friends and makes appeasement 3 times is that she has made clear that, like, she is not that kind of person, that she's not going to do that again, that she acknowledges that there's a kind of mutual acknowledgement that that was wrong. And so the threat that she poses to, like, my integrity or my value as a person who has rights is withdrawn. And so it's no longer sort of as necessary for me to be standing up for myself. So those were just, I think, two sort of elements of this picture where we're thinking of like, why go in for this process? Well, either because the debt's been paid or because the threat that justified sort of taking a stand has been withdrawn. It's no longer a worry. And the question that I wanted to sort of end us with is what's missing from a picture of forgiveness. So Mona, I think, has articulated, and Joy both articulated some of the elements that sort of we haven't yet touched on that seem like important pieces. But we had this passage that we thought sort of brought out a lot of the elements that this picture, at least alone, at least unsupplemented, can't really illuminate or explain.
Okay, so the text we're going to look at is a text that's very, very central to this time of year. And it is a time when Moses goes to God and says, like, you have to forgive the people, and God does forgive the people. And that is after the sin of the golden calf. So we're in Exodus 32. And Moses is like still up on the mountain. When the scene opens, we're on page 5, for those of you following along with the handout. Scene opens, Moses is still up on the mountain, and God says to Moshe, hurry down, because the people who you brought out of Egypt have like destroyed themselves, have acted repulsively, have debased themselves. They have been quick to turn aside from the way that I've told them, and they made for themselves a molten calf. They bowed to it, they sacrificed to it, and they said, "This is your God, O Israel, who brought you out of the land of Egypt." And so that's like statement number 1 of God, recorded statement number 1 of God to Moses, recorded statement number 2, I've seen that this is a stiff-necked people. I've seen this people and they are a stiff-necked people. Now says God, let me be, and my anger will blaze forth against them and I will destroy them, says God. And I have a solution already. Moses, I'll make out of you a replacement new nation. And to any reader of the Bible knows, like, this is God's like go-to solution to things, right? Imagine Noah. People are really bad in the time of Noah. God says, oh, Noah, like, you're okay. I'll make a whole new world out of you, right? This is God's like go-to move. And Moses is like, no, we don't do that anymore. And uses all kinds of like logical reasoning. What are people going to say about you? Are you really such a great God if you just like destroy your people? You took them out of Egypt and then you just destroyed them? Like, that's a terrible thing to do. And Moses says, right, turn from your blazing anger, shuv mechon habacha, v'inachim al hara'ala amacha, renounce the plan to punish your people. And then Moses says, remember our ancestors who you loved so much, right? This is all this like emotional appeal, because the problem is an emotional one, right? God says, let my anger blaze forth and I will destroy all of them. And Moses says, hold your anger in check. Please hold your anger in check. Please shuv, right? That's the same language as teshuva almost. Like, it's Moses trying to do teshuva on behalf of the people a little bit. He's not really in a position to do that, obviously, because he's not the sinner. But saying to God, like, God, you have to do teshuva. You have to turn your anger, release your anger, be appeased in your anger, and that's ultimately what happens. The Lord renounced the punishment he had planned to bring upon his people. But if you think about this in terms of, if you think about this story and God's turning at the end, God's renouncing the punishment, like, is that forgiveness? Does that in any way map onto what we had just discussed? And yet, like, the Jewish tradition uses this as like a paradigm number 1 of God forgiving the people. Like, this is when we, in our liturgy, uses this text over and over and over again as an example of God granting atonement and forgiveness. But like, this does not map on at all to any of the kind of rights language that Quinn was just laying out. And it really doesn't make sense at all unless we start to add in some of the emotional language that Mona was teeing us up for. And that's kind of where we're going in next week and the week after.
And if I can just say one thing about sort of part of why it's sort of so puzzling or wouldn't make sense is I can waive a debt against Leah, but like that's not how emotions work. So like I can very easily just say, you don't owe me $5. If only it were so easy to just say, I'm no longer mad at you and have that be it. But that's not how anger works, right? Anger is not the kind of thing that we just waive in the manner of a rights waiver or a debt waiver. And so if we want to find a place for anger and the renunciation or the letting go of anger as some key part, maybe the main part, the heart of forgiveness, like to think that the heart of forgiveness is in some way about the heart and not about the things that are, not just the things that are done or the things that are owed, then we're going to need something more than just the picture that we thought of today.
Yeah, and so that goes to what Matthew just put into the chat. To me, the Exodus 32 passage looks almost like what we had labeled condoning earlier, which that was the case of like oh, my mother-in-law is so offensive, but I'm just gonna like ignore it or like put it in the corner and not like engage. But what I would say to that is that I don't think that's really what Moses is requesting. Like he's not requesting like God just move past it. He's requesting like hold in your anger, because in your anger, God, you're about to destroy an entire nation of people. He's just requesting like a lowering of the like anger. I'm not saying this very prettily, but like he's kind of requesting like a dialing it down, but not like full on ignore. It's sort of like almost like the way I think about it is like Moses is requesting like an injustice, maybe like that God's anger is actually potentially what the people deserve, and Moses is saying, okay, but like the repercussions of them getting what they deserve are too severe, and that can't like the like moral equation here can't go through. Part one, and then part two is what Quinn just said of like also that's not how anger works. I think we're happy to stick around for, right. Joy says change the amount from $5 to $50,000. Yeah, totally. Right. I think Joy, the point you're making also, like we should have done that from the beginning, like raising the stakes. Yeah, raising the stakes in the whole case from the beginning.
Definitely, the emotions would be higher with the debt.
That's a very fair thing. Stacy said, isn't Moses asking Hashem, asking God to dial it down on behalf of the forefathers? That's one of the arguments. And the other argument is the Lamayom Rumitzrayim Lemor Bera'ot Tiavla Robotam Barim Chalotam Al right? Let not the Egyptians say, right? God, it's going to be embarrassing for you. Let not the Egyptians say it was with evil intent that he delivered them only to kill them off in the mountains and annihilate them from the face of the earth. So there's this two kind of argument, like an argument from love for the forefathers and an argument from like, God, you're going to be embarrassed. Both of which, I mean, there's a lot to be said about like why those arguments, are those the right arguments? Should Moses have said something better? Is that the best you got, Moses? I don't know, right? And then, right, Stacy is saying, right, it's really about mending our relationship with God. Good, hold that. And that's exactly what we're gonna be driving at. Mona had labeled that like a Buberian kind of read onto things. Right?
Yeah, something about, I think this will be the theme of the third session, is like the idea that forgiveness is about repairing a relationship. It's about restoring, it's about putting something back together, or if something wasn't there in the first place, building something that needed to be there, that is under threat from wrongdoing. And so my hope is that sort of not that you leave today's thinking like, oh yeah, forgiveness is just waiving a debt, but that there might be something in this picture that's attractive. I think one thing that I do want to sort of suggest is attractive about this thought, even if we think it's a little empty, if it's not capturing enough, is this idea that wrongdoing is something that happens between people, and that we need to sort of pay attention to the kind of moral relations that we stand in, and that forgiveness it's something about there's this deeply essential nature of forgiveness, which is that it's directed towards a person and from a person. It's not just sort of about a wrong deed.
Any more questions, anyone? Feel free to unmute and just go ahead and verbally ask them if you do have a question. No. Okay, so thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Professor White and Rabbanit Sarna, for this first class in this series. I'm really looking forward to next Monday at 8 p.m. For continuing this. And thank you again, everyone who joined us today on Zoom, on Drisha Live, and on Facebook. We will be live again tomorrow, Tuesday evening at 8 p.m. with a class on forgiveness and atonement in Jewish tradition, philological and philosophical perspectives with Rabbi Zucker. In addition, you can always find out more information about class offerings as well as the registration links on our website at www.drisha.org/classes, or you can watch classes live on our website at www.drisha.org/live. We hope to see everyone again soon at one of our upcoming classes here at Drisha.